Imagine someone in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitor their every heartbeat. Tired eyes reflect the uncertainty of tomorrow. On the other side of the city, a mother holds a test in her hands with an unexpected diagnosis. In another corner, someone is fighting an invisible illness, an emotional pain that consumes their peace. Faced with these situations, many ask, is there a word, a promise, something that can bring healing and hope? The Bible is full of verses about healing, and some psalms are widely known for their message of protection and restoration. Psalm 91, for example, is often recited in times of distress. Psalm 23 brings comfort to the downcast soul. However, there is one psalm that, despite its depth and power, remains almost hidden from many. Hidden between the pages of Scripture, it carries a message that can transform the lives of those facing illness, whether in body, mind, or spirit. Human beings have always sought a cure. Since ancient times, illness was seen as a mystery, something that could be caused by invisible forces or by the fragility of life itself. The Hebrews, the people chosen by God, understood that health was deeply linked to the relationship with the Creator. They believed that God not only protected and sustained, but also had the power to restore. When medicine failed, when resources were scarce, they turned their eyes upward and cried out for help. And that is exactly what happened to David, the author of this psalm. He not only knew physical pain, but also anguish of the soul. Amid battles, betrayals, and moments of loneliness, David experienced the weight of human fragility. However, at a certain point in his life, he raised his voice and recorded words that echo to this day as a testimony to God's power to restore that which seemed lost. Often, when we talk about healing, we only think about the body. We want the fever to stop, for the diagnosis to change, for the pain to disappear. But God's healing goes beyond the physical. How many people live apparently healthy, but carry invisible wounds? Traumas from the past, fears that paralyze them, and resentments that corrode the soul. The disease does not always manifest itself in the body. There are silent pains that accompany many for years without anyone noticing. The psalm we are about to explore speaks directly to these situations. He reminds us that God not only hears the cry of the afflicted, but also responds. He who created every cell in our body, who formed us in the womb, also has the power to restore what was broken. It doesn't matter the type of illness. It doesn't matter how long the pain persists. There is a promise of restoration for those who trust in the Lord. Given this, an essential question arises. How can we connect with this promise? How can we bring this word into our reality, apply it in our daily lives, and allow it to produce transformation? The first step is to understand the context in which this psalm was written, as this helps us see its depth. Furthermore, it is necessary to look at words with an open heart, allowing them to reach the deepest areas of our existence. Over the centuries, thousands of people have found comfort and healing in the Scriptures. There are reports of people who, when meditating on these verses, experienced something extraordinary. Some felt peace in the midst of the storm, others saw their health restored, and many discovered an inner strength they never knew they possessed. This does not mean that difficulties disappear like magic, but rather that, when we delve into the Word of God, we find something much greater than the simple absence of illness. We find purpose, renewal, and hope. If there is anything this psalm teaches us, it is that God is not far away. He is not indifferent to human suffering. On the contrary, He presents Himself as the one who listens, who responds, and who has the power to transform. In moments of despair, when all seems lost, His word becomes a safe haven. And when we understand this truth, our perspective changes. We must remember that healing does not always come in the way we expect. Sometimes we look for an instant miracle, but God works in a deeper process. It not only restores the body, but also heals the heart. It transforms the mind, renews strength, and brings a peace that goes beyond human understanding. This means that regardless of the circumstances, there is hope for those who place their trust in Him. The journey through this psalm will lead us to a deeper understanding of the way God works in the lives of those who seek Him. Every word, every verse carries a powerful meaning. It is an invitation to look beyond the visible, to trust the invisible, and to believe that, even in the midst of difficulties, God continues to be the God who heals. This is not just a message for those who are sick. It is a message for everyone who, at some point, has felt the weight of human fragility. It's a reminder that no matter what we face, we are never alone. There is an eternal promise of restoration, and that promise lives on today. At the time the Psalms were written, the view on health and illness was very different from what we have today. Medicine as we know it was still in its most primitive stages. In many ancient cultures, illnesses were believed to be direct consequences of sins or divine punishments. Among the Hebrews, the understanding of illness involved not only the body, but also the soul and the relationship with God. David, the author of the psalm we are exploring, lived during the period when Israel was still consolidating its identity as a nation. It was a time of battles, alliances, and challenges. But it was also a time when trust in the Lord was essential for survival. David understood that his destiny was in God's hands. He did not view health as just a physical state, but as part of a spiritual relationship. When he cried out for healing, he was not just asking for relief for his body, but also for restoration for his soul. The scriptures show that David faced moments of great suffering. There were periods when his physical health was weakened, whether due to battle wounds, illness, or the emotional weight of his own decisions. In many of his psalms, we find requests for help, cries for mercy, and expressions of deep anguish. However, we also find testimonies of deliverance and words of gratitude for being restored. Psalm 30 reflects exactly this experience. When he writes that he cried out to God and was healed, he is not just reporting an isolated fact, but testifying about the character of God. For David, healing was not just a miraculous event, but a testament to divine care. He knew that regardless of the circumstances, the Lord had the power to restore his life. In addition to David's personal context, it is important to understand the mentality of the Hebrew people regarding healing. Unlike neighboring civilizations, where medicine was often linked to pagan religious practices, in Israel, health was seen as part of the covenant with God. The people believed that obeying the commandments brought protection and well-being, while turning away from God could result in adverse consequences, including illness. This does not mean that all illness was seen as a direct punishment, but rather that life, health, and healing were in the hands of the Creator. This perspective led to many of the Psalms being written not just as poems of praise, but as true prayers of intercession. When David writes that he cried out and was healed, he is expressing the belief that God is not indifferent to human suffering. Another interesting aspect of Psalm 30 is how it combines anguish and celebration. At first, David remembers the affliction and danger he faced. It then exalts God's faithfulness in delivering him. This teaches us that even in the most difficult times, there is hope. Healing may not be immediate, but the promise of restoration is there. At that time, healing was not something easily accessible. There were no hospitals like the ones we have today, nor medicines developed based on modern scientific knowledge. Medicine at the time was based on herbs, oils, and rudimentary treatments, often administered by priests or healers. For a king like David, the resources available might be better than those of the majority of the people, but they were still limited. This helps us understand why prayer was so essential. When human possibilities came to an end, only faith remained. And this reality has not changed. Even today, no matter how advanced medicine is, there are times when doctors find themselves without answers. Faced with these situations, many turn their eyes upward, seeking a miracle. What Psalm 30 teaches us is that this miracle can happen in ways we don't always understand. The historical context of the psalm also helps us understand the importance of gratitude in David's life. Not only did he seek healing, but he also recognized divine intervention when it occurred. This is a crucial point. We often ask God for help in times of crisis, but forget to give thanks when the answer arrives. Psalm 30 reminds us that healing is not just a gift, but a testimony that must be shared. Throughout history, this psalm has been a source of comfort for many people. In times of plague, war, and crisis, his words were recited by those seeking hope. David's experience became a model of faith for future generations. He teaches us that even when we face the valley of the shadow of death, there is a God who hears, who responds, and who has the power to restore. If you would like to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. By understanding the context in which this psalm was written, we can realize that it is not just a personal story, but a universal truth. He speaks of the nature of God, his love for those who seek him, and his willingness to restore lives. This message remains current and relevant. Humanity still faces illnesses and still deals with pain and uncertainty. But the promise of this psalm remains. There is healing for those who cry out to the Lord. David begins Psalm 30 with a powerful testimony. He cried out to God for help and was healed. This statement is not just a declaration of relief, but a proof of divine faithfulness. He does not say that he found a solution on his own or that he was saved by chance. He attributes his healing exclusively to God, recognizing that, without the Lord, his situation could have been irreversible. The healing mentioned here can encompass several dimensions. In the context of Scripture, the word heal often goes beyond the physical. It also refers to emotional and spiritual restoration. David not only regained his health, but also experienced a renewal of his soul. He had gone through times of deep anguish, perhaps even depression, and seen the hand of God bring complete restoration. This cry for help reflects something many experience in times of illness. When the pain becomes unbearable, when doctors have no more answers, when all seems lost, the human heart naturally turns to God. Even those who don't have a life of faith often find themselves praying in the midst of despair. It is at this moment that prayer becomes a cry of the soul, a sincere plea for help. But does God always respond with immediate healing? This is one of the big questions surrounding faith. Many witness instant and miraculous cures, while others go through long journeys of treatment and recovery. There are also those who, even in constant prayer, do not see the restoration they expected. However, the promise of this psalm teaches us that God hears the cry of the afflicted and acts according to his sovereign will. Healing can come in different forms. Sometimes it happens supernaturally, with no medical explanation. Other times, God uses available resources, such as doctors, medicines, and treatments, to bring about restoration. There are also times when healing occurs internally, when the soul finds peace, even in the midst of adversity. David understood this reality. He knew that his life depended completely on God. Therefore, his response to the healing was not just silent gratitude, but a song of praise. He made a point of recording his experience so that others could learn from it. His testimony reminds us that God is not indifferent to human suffering. He sees, he hears, and he responds. Psalm 30 challenges us to trust, even when healing does not come in the time or form we expect. Faith is not based only on what we see, but on the certainty that God remains in control, regardless of the circumstances. The cry for help always reaches the Lord's ears, and his answer, whatever it may be, will always be for the good of those who trust in him. The experience of suffering is something that has accompanied humanity since the beginning. When David writes that weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning, he is not just expressing a poetic thought, but conveying a profound truth about God's actions. This statement shows that suffering has a determined time and that in the end, restoration always arrives. However, for those going through the dark night of pain and illness, this promise may seem far away. After all, how many nights has anyone gone without seeing the morning light? How many days of struggle and uncertainty seem to go on without an answer? The metaphor of night and morning reveals the dynamic between despair and hope. The night symbolizes moments of anguish, when everything seems uncertain. It is in the night of the soul that we face our greatest fears, that the pain seems more intense, and that the answers seem distant. But the morning represents God's intervention, the fresh start, the renewal of hope. This cycle is visible in several passages of the Bible and in David's own life. David faced many nights of tears before experiencing the joy of restoration. In his youth, he was persecuted by Saul, who tried to kill him several times. He hid in caves, starved himself, and lived as a fugitive, not knowing when his pain would end. Later, as king, he faced battles, betrayals, and personal crises that led him to moments of deep sadness. In some psalms, he describes nights of intense crying, of anguished souls, and an afflicted heart. However, even in the most difficult moments, he maintained confidence that God would bring an answer. The story of Job is another example of the reality of this promise. He lost everything: his children, his health, his wealth. His night of suffering was long, full of unanswered questions and indescribable pain. But at the end of his journey, God restored his life in an extraordinary way. The joy of the morning came to him, showing that God's faithfulness is unchanging, even when we do not understand the reasons for suffering. This promise was also definitively fulfilled in the life of Christ. His crucifixion was the darkest night the world has ever seen. His disciples were in shock, desperate, unable to see any hope. But on the third day, on the morning of the resurrection, victory was revealed. The pain of the night gave way to the glory of the new day, and this truth became the foundation of the Christian faith. But what does this promise mean for those who are still waiting for the morning to come? For those who face a prolonged illness, for those who deal with pain that seems to have no end, and for those who are looking for an answer and cannot see a way out? It means that God does not ignore human suffering. He sees every tear shed, hears every prayer, and knows every pain. The night may be long, but it is not eternal. Faith does not prevent us from going through difficulties, but it gives us the certainty that they will not last forever. God's promise is not the absence of suffering, but the guarantee that He is present in the midst of pain and that joy will come at the right time. We often hope that the morning will bring the exact solution we desire. We want healing to happen instantly, for the situation to be resolved without delay. But God works in ways that we cannot always understand. Sometimes healing comes directly and miraculously. Other times, He leads us through a process of learning and growth. In some moments, the greatest transformation happens within us when we discover an inexplicable peace, even in the midst of difficulties. The joy of the morning can be the restoration of health, but it can also be the renewal of faith. It can be healing the body, but it can also be healing the soul. God's promise is that the night of affliction will never be eternal. He always brings a new day, a new hope, a new beginning. David wrote this psalm after experiencing this truth in his own life. He knew what it was like to cry in the night, but he also knew what it was like to see God's goodness at dawn. This is a promise that remains valid for all those who trust in the Lord. Regardless of the situation you are facing, remember, the night may be long, but the morning always comes. David not only cried out for healing and was restored, but he also understood that his experience of suffering and deliverance should not remain silent. He wrote, "You turned my crying into dancing. You took off my garment of mourning and clothed me with joy." This transformation was not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Lament gave way to celebration, and despair became a living testimony to the power of God. Many people face long periods of illness and distress, feeling that their pain will never end. However, the promise contained in this verse reminds us that God not only heals, but also restores the joy that pain has stolen. The lives of those who experience God's touch never remain the same. When healing comes, whether instantly or in a gradual process, the natural response is praise. It's not just about being happy that the pain is over, but about recognizing that God was present in every moment of the process. Throughout the Bible, we see countless accounts of people who went through pain but later witnessed the transformation that God wrought in their lives. One of the most striking examples is that of King Hezekiah. He was stricken with a deadly disease and was told he would die. In despair, he turned to God in prayer, crying out for more time to live. The Lord heard his cry and granted him another 15 years. Faced with this miracle, Hezekiah not only recovered, but also exalted God, recognizing that his restoration was not the result of chance, but of divine mercy. Another striking example is Job. He lost everything: health, family, wealth. His pain was intense and prolonged. However, when God's appointed time arrived, Job was completely restored. God not only healed his wounds, but gave him double everything he had lost. Just as David describes in the 30 Psalms, Job's garment of mourning was exchanged for garments of joy. But there is something essential in these testimonies that often goes unnoticed: the importance of gratitude and recognition of God's action. When David writes that God turned his mourning into dancing, he is not just describing a moment of relief. He is declaring that his entire life has been transformed by this experience. His relationship with God deepened, his faith was strengthened, and he now had a testimony to share with others. Often after a period of suffering, it is easy to just move on and forget what God has done. But Psalm 30 teaches us that healing must not only be received, but also witnessed. When we share what God has done in our lives, we strengthen other people's faith. Someone experiencing a night of weeping can find hope in hearing that the morning of restoration is real. The transformation described by David also teaches us that God does not just want to alleviate pain, but to bring about profound change. Often, moments of suffering shape us, teach us to depend more on Him, and prepare us for something greater. Weeping becomes dancing, not just because the pain has passed, but because the experience has made us stronger, more sensitive to God's voice, and more prepared to encourage others. True healing, according to the Bible, is not just in the restoration of the body, but in the renewal of the heart. How many people receive a physical healing but remain trapped in fear, bitterness, or unbelief? David teaches us that complete healing involves a process of inner transformation. When God intervenes, He not only solves the momentary problem, but also gives us a new purpose, a new joy, and a new way of seeing life. This change manifests itself in several ways. Some begin to live with more gratitude, valuing each day as a gift from God. Others become instruments to help those who are still in the crying phase, sharing their stories and bringing hope. Regardless of the form, the natural response to divine healing should be a life of praise. Therefore, the last part of Psalm 30 is an invitation to celebration. David ends by exalting God, declaring that his soul will sing praises forever. He understands that his story is not just about pain and deliverance, but about God's faithfulness in all circumstances. This is a powerful reminder that no matter what we face, our hope is not in a specific outcome, but in the character of God, who turns weeping into dancing and the garment of mourning into the garment of joy. David ends the 30th Psalm with a powerful statement: "So that my soul may sing praises to you and not be silent. Lord my God, I will give you thanks forever." This statement reveals that the healing experience does not end with the relief of pain, but turns into an ongoing testimony of gratitude. The praise that springs from a heart that has experienced restoration is not something temporary, but an eternal response to God's actions. Throughout this psalm, David took us through his journey of suffering, outcry, divine response, and transformation. He began by recalling a period of distress when he cried out to the Lord for help and was healed. Afterwards, he highlighted how pain and joy are part of the walk with God, but divine fidelity always prevails. Now, at the end of his words, he teaches us that gratitude must be a permanent mark in the lives of those who have been reached by the Lord's mercy. This principle is repeated throughout the Bible. When Jesus healed someone, he often commanded the person to testify or glorify God for the miracle. In Luke's Gospel, we find the story of the 10 lepers who were cleansed by Jesus. They were all healed, but only one came back to give thanks. He prostrated himself at the Master's feet, exalting God for his restoration. Jesus then asked a crucial question. Were not 10 healed? Where are the other 9? This account shows us that many received the blessing, but few returned to show gratitude. Gratitude is not just a feeling, but an attitude that transforms our way of living. When we recognize what God has done, our perspective changes. We begin to see life not just as a succession of difficulties and overcomings, but as a journey in which each moment reflects divine grace. Praising God for healing means not only recognizing His power, but also trusting that He will continue to sustain our lives, regardless of what lies ahead. Many see healing as the end of a process, but it is actually a transition point. After being restored, David did not return to his routine as if nothing had happened. He chose to turn his experience into a permanent song of praise. This teaches us that every intervention of God in our lives must generate a lasting impact. If God heals us, delivers us from danger, or gives us a new opportunity, our response must be a renewed commitment to Him. But what happens when the healing we hope for doesn't come on time or in the way we want? Can we still sing praises and give thanks? Psalm 30 reminds us that God's faithfulness is not limited to specific circumstances. Even if the divine response does not happen as expected, He remains worthy of being praised. Many people witness miraculous healings, but others experience restoration processes that last for years. Some face lifelong health challenges and yet find peace and joy in God. The Apostle Paul is an example of this. He spoke of a thorn in the flesh that caused him suffering, something he repeatedly prayed for to be removed. But God responded differently than he expected, saying, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul then chose to praise God even without receiving the healing he desired. He understood that God's presence was sufficient and that His strength was manifest in the midst of his weakness. Psalm 30 teaches us that our life should not be defined by the difficulties we face, but by how we respond to God's actions. If He heals, we glorify His name. If He sustains us through pain, we also worship Him. The joy that comes in the morning does not just mean the absence of problems, but the certainty that God is with us at each stage of the journey. David ends his song by declaring that his soul will never be silent. This is a calling for all of us. When we experience God's grace, we should proclaim it to the world. Our praise should not depend on circumstances, but on the conviction that the Lord is good and His mercy endures forever. This is true healing, a heart transformed by the presence of God, regardless of external situations. Thus, Psalm 30 invites us to trust, to hope, and to praise. Whether in times of illness or health, of sadness or joy, our faith must remain unshakable. He who heals us, who restores us, and who turns our crying into dance is the same one who sustains us every day. And for this, as David declared, we must give thanks to the Lord forever. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. The Word of God always brings us answers and renewal. Each psalm carries a unique and powerful message, and there is so much more for us to explore together. If this content made sense to you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us get this message to even more people. Now, I invite you to the next video, where we dive into another transformative passage from the Bible. I'm sure it will open your vision to something new and lead you to deep reflections. Click now and continue this journey with me.